A bigger muscle is a stronger muscle, right? Well, kind of. At the end of today's video, I'm going to introduce what I'll call the specificity continuum, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Now, before we dive in, let's set the stage a little bit. If you're familiar with the powerlifting world, it's common for lifters to do a lot of accessory work with the goal of getting bigger, or more technically, experiencing muscle hypertrophy. You may have even heard of quote-unquote off-season programming for powerlifters, where the goal is to improve body composition. So gain muscle and potentially also lose fat in hopes that this will increase strength potential for meet prep training when closer to a meet, or just when that lifter wants to take a run at PRs in the gym. I do think these general concepts check out, but understanding why they check out should help with your training. I think a lot of lifters lack a foundational understanding of key concepts required to get the most out of their accessory work. From a research perspective, I'll start by acknowledging that this concept at its most fundamental level, whether an increase in muscle size causes an increase in muscle strength, is hotly contested in the research. We could do a whole separate video on this topic, so let us know in the comments if you'd like to see us get in the weeds here. In terms of where we fall in this debate, our general opinion is that increasing muscle size is a meaningful contributor to increases in muscle strength and thus powerlifting performance. I think part of the uncertainty we see in the research is due to the fact that we're often only measuring one muscle, and beyond that, we're often measuring a single site on a muscle. Let's consider a basic example. My client Steven started off on our Infinity program system about 3 years ago, and his squat was a little under 400 pounds. He transitioned to our one-on-one coaching about halfway through this, and he recently squatted 512 pounds in competition. This is really solid progress for a lifter that's already pretty advanced, trains 3 times a week, balances training with his family life and career, and is the same body weight he was at 3 years ago. In reflecting on Steven's progress, I think a huge factor in driving his squat up was targeting what we like to call the strength limiter. We'll define the strength limiter as the muscle or the muscles that are the first to fail to produce sufficient force as load increases or failure nears. In other words, it's the muscle that gives out first, and thus, if we improve the force capacity of this muscle, that should be one of our most efficient ways of driving strength up. This strength limiter assessment is something I'm always looking out for as a coach, and it's built right into our Infinity Programs product. Let's take a quick look at Steven's squat. As you can see, his knees don't slide back right out of the hole. I'm sure you've seen a lot of lifters' knees slide way back when they come out of the hole with a heavy load, causing them to bend over. This would generally be someone whose quads are their strength limiter. Steven's sticking point, on the other hand, is on the higher side in the range of motion, right around where the hip extension demands are the highest. As a result, Infinity picked up that more hip extension training, primarily to train the glutes, would do wonders for his squat. There's a good amount of options for hip extension training that's specific to the squat pattern, but one in particular that has been Steven's bread and butter for a while now is high foot placement leg press. This variation increases the hip extension demands, again primarily for the glutes, compared to a lower foot placement leg press, which would increase the knee extension demands for the quads. Now, it's hard to say exactly how much this variation and other hip extension exercises we've done, it's hard to say how much that's contributed to Steven's squat gains compared to if we were to do more quad biased accessories. But what I will say is that we tried a 12-week cycle with quad focused accessory work, and if anything, his squat may have gone down a touch during that cycle. So I'm not going to mess with it for now, given we've been making steady gains since he switched back to it. So returning to the research, if we're testing, say, a multi-joint movement from a group of participants with varying strength limiters, that's really hard to account for. And while I'm focused on muscle-specific strength limiters in this video, I'll also note that some lifters' strength limiters are more skill-based. Beyond what's limiting someone's strength, I also want you to think about how muscle size is often measured in a lab. Here's an example from a recent paper. As you can tell, you're typically just looking at whole muscle, in this case, muscle thickness. We don't know how that muscle grew, and we just don't have much insight into what is actually going on under the hood there. Now, I've been studying exercise science going on 9 years now, and in my very first exercise science class, we learned what's called the SAID principle, which stands for specific adaptations to imposed demands. The principle is straightforward, right? The adaptations are based on the stimulus provided. But I'm frequently humbled by this principle, as a lot of things really do come down to specificity. In terms of our discussion here, I want to introduce you to a concept called task-specific hypertrophy, which was coined by Kyle Travis, an excellent researcher that's done a lot of work in strength sports. He pointed out that the nature of hypertrophy, so the proteins that are actually expanding within whole muscle, and even ultrastructural adaptations, such as the orientation at which sarcomeres are added, is likely specific to the task that elicited those adaptations. Make sure you're subscribed because we'll have another video diving into these specific adaptations even further and what they mean for your training. But for now, I want to introduce you to what I'll call the task-specific hypertrophy continuum. As you can see, the most specific way to accrue hypertrophy that directly contributes to a lift, in this example a 1RM squat, would be to do 1RM squats. However, we know that's not practical, and that's why the second most specific way to stimulate hypertrophy for a 1 rep max squat would be to do higher rep squat training. Even then, we may not be efficient enough in stimulating hypertrophy, especially for the strength limiter, and that leads us to accessory movements like the high foot placement leg press like we saw before, or similar movements like, say, a belt squat. And lastly, we can include some single joint exercises if the tolerable workload that can be performed on the previous 3 options still wasn't enough. So with that, let's finish up with some takeaways. Number 1, hypertrophy work should be for the prime movers in the lifts you care about. Shoulder work isn't going to help your squat all that much, so make sure you're training the muscles contributing to the lift. Number 2, even better, bias hypertrophy work to your strength limiters. This requires some biomechanics knowledge, but you may already know what your limiter is and how to train it. It may also be helpful to hear that we can never know for sure what our strength limiter is, so we have to also keep an eye on what approach leads to the best strength gains in sort of a trial and error fashion anyway. And lastly, I encourage you to work backwards from maximum specificity for your hypertrophy work. Again, in a perfect world, we'd get all of our volume from the main lift itself, but it's typically necessary to use variations, especially if that's a more efficient way to attack your strength limiter. All right, that is the video. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next one.